Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. I've been asked by many persons to share some thoughts in relation to the current impasse or imbroglio as it relates to the non-appointment thus far. Today is 1st May 2020. It's after 8 a.m. and there still has been no announcement in relation to the appointment of a substantive Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly. Now, this is an important aspect of our understanding of the law, in that when you look at the relevant sections in terms of the THA Act, you look at what it says in terms of Section 8, which speaks to the appointment of a Chief Secretary. It says, upon the election referred to in Section 7, and that deals with the election of a presiding officer, the assemblymen shall elect from among their number the Chief Secretary and the Deputy Chief Secretary. Now, when you look at the definition and what it relates to as assemblymen, under Section 5, it speaks to the assembly shall be a body corporate and shall consist of 12 assemblymen elected at an election. So in other words, the only persons who are eligible to vote for the Chief Secretary would be from among the 12 assemblymen. All right, so no one else can vote for that. However, in terms of the nomination process, it's interesting because the THA Act allows under Section 8, and then when you go into Section 11, it speaks of how this is done. It says, in the case of elections held under Section 8, the presiding officer shall receive nominations of candidates from any assemblyman or councillor. So, in other words, even the non-elected members, okay, because remember the THA Assembly, you have the 12 assemblymen who are elected at the THA elections, which those elections are held every 4 years, but then you also have 3 councillors who are appointed by the winning party, and then you have 1 councillor appointed by the minority. So therefore you have 4 councillors present also along with the 12 assemblymen. The 4 councillors are eligible to also nominate someone for the position of Chief Secretary. Now, interestingly enough, at this stage, if it is that a special sitting of the assembly is called, there's nothing to prevent the minority from putting up their own candidate to be elected as Chief Secretary. Of course, the question would be the amount of votes that person may get. But given the very fluid situation with the politics in Tobago, one never knows how this may go. And you may very well see at such a sitting that the minority decides, notwithstanding the fact that there are only 3 assemblymen among the minority, you may still see them putting up a candidate for the position of Chief Secretary, because the way it works, if we look at Section 11 of the THA Act, it says the person, right, where it says the person elected to an office shall be the candidate receiving the highest number of votes. So it doesn't mean that you have to come from the ruling party or from the minority party. It's simply the person who receives the highest number of votes. So in other words, there could be quite a conundrum if it is that someone from the minority is nominated and they manage to garner support or votes from the government side, from the winning side, and they can then end up with the majority of votes and end up being the Chief Secretary. Because remember, the voting is done by secret ballot. It's done in secret, so therefore no one knows who voted for whom. So it really does create an interesting dynamic. Another thing to consider is whether there will be more than one candidate from among the ruling party to contest the position of Chief Secretary. So in other words, if there's more than one nomination made, And if the votes, they have 9 members, if the votes end up being 5-4, split amongst themselves in terms of their 9 votes, then you may have a scenario where the 3 minority votes could end up being the deciding factor on who ultimately becomes chief secretary. In other words, they may then choose to vote for one of those candidates or another. So the dynamic is very interesting. But there are just a couple things to still bear in mind. At this point, there is no executive council of the THA in existence, because under the THA Act, it specifically states that the executive council comprises, and it gives a list of persons, and one of those persons is the chief secretary. And currently there's no chief secretary, so there's no executive council at this time. Another point to consider is that the Act actually specifies no set procedure. In fact, it does not even mention a scenario such as this, which is the voluntary resignation of a chief secretary of his own accord. It talks about resigning where there's a motion of no confidence, but that's not the scenario here. It also talks about scenarios where someone resigns their seat as a member, but at this point, we are not clear that this is what Mr. Charles has done. We are not clear that he has resigned as a Secretary of Education either. All we saw is an announcement from the Office of the Chief Secretary. In fact, as yet, I have not seen in the media, I don't know if persons have copies of it, but I have not seen the actual resignation letter of Mr. Charles. And it's important for us to see that. That resignation letter must be seen and made public, because we need to know, did he resign only as Chief Secretary? Did he resign as Secretary of Education? Did he resign as a member of the Assembly? Because each of those have different implications. Because if you resign as a member of the Assembly, that immediately triggers a by-election, and the President has to be notified, and a by-election has to be called for his seat. If he resigns as Secretary, then that creates a vacancy that has to be filled. And any new or incoming Chief Secretary actually has the opportunity under the legislation to appoint new secretaries. So even the current secretaries, their positions are not cast in stone, because when you look at how the legislation is worded in terms of the appointment of secretaries, it is the chief secretary who advises the president who shall be the secretaries. It also says that the chief secretary must consult with the other members of the executive council, but he doesn't have to take their advice. The law is, since the case of Jimmy Bain, that seminal decision, we know that the law is that consult simply means that, look, okay, yes, I discuss with you, but I don't have to take your advice. That's what the legal meaning of consult is. So there are several different interesting scenarios swirling around in this, current THA impasse. That's the only way I could describe it, because it really is regrettable, that at this point there appears to be no clear directive from anyone indicating the way forward for Tobago, and at present there is no executive council. If you look at section 33 of the THA Act, the executive council shall comprise the chief secretary, the deputy chief secretary, and then it goes on to list the other persons. So once there's no chief secretary, there's no executive council at this point. All right. Last point to note, when you look at the definition section in the legislation, it says, and this is quite interesting because it is as enlightening as it is vague. The definition section C speaks of the definition of chief secretary as being the chief secretary, and it then goes on to say that this includes, all right, I'll read the exact section for you so that you'll understand the conundrum that it creates. Chief Secretary means the person elected as such under Section 8 and includes the Deputy Chief Secretary where the context so requires. So what does that really mean? In other words, if there's no Chief Secretary, then does it mean that the Deputy Chief Secretary is the Chief Secretary? Because it says the definition of Chief Secretary includes Deputy Chief Secretary. So what? Do we have a Chief Secretary now in the form of the Deputy Chief Secretary? And then, in such case, Do we then have elections for a deputy chief secretary, which doesn't make any sense because you have a substantive deputy chief secretary? But the legislation, I think this THA legislation really needs tremendous reworking. I think it's time for us to all be mature enough to understand that it has run its course. It has, at this point, largely outlived its usefulness in its present format, and we need to take a long, hard look at it for the future to ensure that we redraft it in a way that it becomes more meaningful, useful, and efficacious.